The only thing that should be standardized is opportunity. No testing, no curriculums, no none of that. Opportunity is what should be standardized. Yes, the curriculum should be, like for you all in Nova Scotia, the curriculum your curriculum should have all the following. So it should have a hyper localized context. So in other words, if I'm studying, provincial history, Canadian history, stories, all those sorts of things, there should be a significant component that is hyper localized, because ultimately, if you think about it in terms of that is what many of your students are going to be most familiar with, most understandable to, and most immersed in. And once you've done that, it allows for the ability to broaden your scope of understanding. My whole thing around that is, and it ties in with the keynote, to be honest with you all. The better you understand yourself, that lends itself to you have a better understanding of others. You can't have an equitable and inclusive learning environment until you first become an equitable and inclusive person. And so I extrapolate that into the whole idea around our student learning experiences, that they should be hyper localized within a context. And I know you all have done work with Dr. Holly as well. If you think in terms of being culturally responsive and culturally relevant, that is the line with being hyper localized. And yes, Janine, it does. It ties in with that. Absolutely. And so in the context of this statement, I do believe this. Here's the thing, not every student is going to have the same needs as a classmate at the same time, all the time. We're human beings. They vary, they change. We need to adapt. And so that's why I truly believe this statement. And like I said, it was aligned with, again, my manifesto rather than my educational philosophy. Adam, thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. See, this is why I love the chat. This is faster than Twitter, so thank you all. So now here's a question for all of you. Since achievement is usually associated with data, and I'll share with you later how big data dehumanizes. Since achievement is usually associated with numerical values, I want to borrow from Educator to ask you all this question, and feel free to put it in the chat as well. When it comes to learning, what experience do you want students to have? And Jim, thank you for that comment. Your father was on point. So if you all could share in the chat here, and if we can do it kind of in the chat, and I'd love for maybe one of you or a couple of you to unmute your microphone and just verbalize or vocalize your thoughts. When it comes to learning, what experience do you want students to have?
Learners need to create rather than recreate. I'm an arts teacher, music, and so many times we have options for students to recreate something else, when in fact, the best learning comes when they create.
Thank you. And so I'm going to admit that I have a bias for art teachers. I taught art for a couple of years. And so, yes, not recreate, create. And if you look at the comments here, a lot of you have talked about safety, safe, inspirational. So Janine's comment, Anne, was the aha moment of discovering something new and realizing that they did it themselves. So if you all notice, here's the interesting thing, which is why I love asking this question. Not a single one of you put, I want students, and again, that's why I highlight the word experience here. I want my students to score 100% on 100% of their tests. We're adding value to the experience rather than to the numerical attachment. And if that is our default, then I can tell you that there will be a direct correlation between that and, of course, the numerical value. So I'm not going to diminish the use of numbers or quantitative data for feedback and for support, but I think quantitative data should be secondary to experiential data, which is how do the students feel? And remember, going back to what I shared in the keynote, are they seen? Are they heard? Are they loved? That's it. And so for me, my experience with the students, I wanted every student as you all indicated, and I shared with you in several examples, I want every student to experience safety, authenticity, and vulnerability within the context of the learning they did with me. So the vulnerability was aligned with the risk taking, which you'll see that come up later. The safety was that you can be your whole true self, and if you are your whole true self, you are being authentic. And so for me, I did that. And I'll share with you all on a side note, there were many instances where either I made mistakes or I had something that was normalized in class that after getting feedback from students, I recognized that I needed to change. And so one of the things that I did to essentially model authenticity is I would name it. I would tell the students, you know what, I've been doing the following, and several of your classmates or students in another class period shared with me the following, and as a result, these are the changes I'm going to make, and I want you all to hold me accountable for those changes. And it was interesting because if you think even in terms of me just sharing that with students, again, going back to that whole power dynamic, I'm trying to keep it as level as possible so that all students recognize their agency, and that by me modeling my degrees of vulnerability, it simultaneously allowed for me to model authenticity, which is what I wanted to see in the students anyway. So thank you all for your contributions with that. And so ultimately with this session, we're going to look at all of the following. We're going to look at, again, the use of technology, which will be one of the activities we will do. We're going to look at, ideally, if I'm doing my job, I will provoke thought, which hopefully I already have done that to some degree. And then hopefully we'll foster some new ideas for you all in regards to not only how you're using technology, but how we can be mindful of our uses of technology for sustainability in terms of equitable and accessible learning environments. So I want to do an activity with you all real quick. I'm getting ready to display 4 different images, and at the end, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to give some thought around what is the connection between those 4 images, okay? So I'll display each one for roughly about 10 seconds. So here's the first one. And then next. 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 All right. Take about a minute and give some thought, and then I'll ask you to share thoughts in the chat, and then maybe one of you with your microphone. What do you identify as the connection between those 4 images? Go. All right. Can you all share in the chat? And again, we'll just, because I can't call on anyone, if anyone wants to share their thoughts, what do you identify as a connection between those 4 images? So if you don't mind, share it in the chat, or if any of you want to turn on your microphone, please go for it.
I felt like they were all different views of education. So somebody who might be talking about education, they might pick one of those images to talk about it.
Thank you, Anne. Anyone else want to share?
I thought they were all relevant pieces of education, but in the pictures, the connections weren't happening, and the kid said it all in the end. I got all my stuff. I'm not engaged.
Thank you, Maggie.
There are resources, but without action, without interconnection, without testing out the ideas, you can end up with just crumpled pieces of paper, frustrated, and nothing on your worksheet.
Thank you. Anyone else? And Gail, that was you, yes? Because I had to move my screen so I can see everyone.
That was me.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Yeah, see, I had to move some so I can see everyone's name here. Okay, perfect. Thank you all. So you all are onto something, and yes, ultimately for me, these all of these images represent what I would say learning environments and learning opportunities. So I'll run through them real quick here. So one, this to me here represents access and opportunity. So I will share with you all, that is how I simply define equity: access and opportunity. In an equitable learning environment, all students have access that provides them with opportunity. So here, to me, the technology, as I shared at the beginning, technology provides access and opportunity that textbooks do not. So if you think in terms of the use of textbooks, textbooks generally are filtered and sanitized, and in some cases skewed information. You can't determine in some cases what appears in a textbook, but if a textbook is part of a mandated curriculum, I always encourage educators to ask the question, if that textbook is part of a mandated curriculum, who made a decision as to what ended up in the textbook, who made a decision as to what needs to be mandated, and who determined what's important and what's not as to why, in regards to what information appears in the textbook and what doesn't. And that's why I love using technology, because now, again, remember, it democratizes access to information. This one right here represents what I call exclusionary by design. So what you're looking at represents the configuration and image representation of every single classroom that I was in, and that sadly still exists in many schools. So first of all, think about it in terms of, is this a good design for access and opportunity for students to collaborate, for students to communicate, for students to do anything besides what I call linear learning, which is it comes from one end of the room and goes back to the other end of the room. And the reason why I share this in regards on a personal level is the fact that my last name starts with an S. And so, you know, I come from a family of educators. I am not, you know, and it's one of the interesting stereotypes that I love to share and debunk with folks is the fact that I am not the first in my family to go to college. I'm not second generation. I'm not third generation. I'm at minimum fourth. And so the reason why I share that is because school is game. And part of that game for me is along the lines of the fact that in general, if you are in a classroom where the teacher makes class participation a component of your grade, which they shouldn't, because that is aligned with, again, exclusionary by design, and it's also a byproduct of ableism, in my opinion. They generally will call on who's ever in the middle and the front more often than they will who's in the back. And so, of course, I always asked to sit in the front, but I was always told no for two reasons. One, my last name starts with an S, and so the teacher wanted the seating chart to be nicely aligned with where you, to correspond with the roster, so it made it easier on them to take roll. In addition to that, you know, I'm, well, I forgot how to do the conversion. I think I'm 1 meter, I'm 6 foot 1 inch. So what is that, 1 meter 81, I think? At any rate, I am, the teachers would always say, you're going to obstruct the view of your classmates. So I was never allowed to sit in the front. And Jim actually mentioned in the chat, yes, when it comes to a socially distanced environment, that's an added layer of a challenge in regards to configurations of rooms. And this goes into the whole idea, as I shared earlier, you know, even when it comes to COVID-19, how are we using technology for inclusion, accessibility, and opportunity? So you see, if we can't control the physical environment, we still at least hopefully have a higher degree of control of the learning environment, whether it's physical or digital. And so then continuing on, I would argue that the use of technology actually can make us more connected rather than disconnected. So you notice two here, it doesn't look like they're engaged with each other, but look at what we are doing literally right now. If it weren't for technology, I wouldn't be able to spend this time with all of you. Okay, Maggie, you still imperial measurement. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. I don't know why so on a side note, I was in high school, I believe, when there was a big push for the United States to shift to metric measurement system. And of course it was like, no. So I believe there's only 2 or 3 countries in the world that use imperial measurements that we do. But at any rate, I digress. My whole point here is that technology actually can make us more connected. And because of technology, we are connected right now. And so again, I wouldn't have the opportunity to spend this time with you all and do the keynote if it weren't for it. And then lastly, I use this one as my stance against homework and what I call non-engaging learning activities, i.e. worksheets, because ultimately they are inaccessible and exclusionary by design. They do not provide opportunity for learning growth. They're not learner centered. And you know, my thing around homework, which has been magnified now because of COVID-19, which is hilarious to me, and I don't mean it in a humorous way, because I used to get a lot of resistance when I would say homework is inequitable by design. When you assign work and you expect the student to do it outside of the school day, you are making a massive assumption. You are assuming that all of your students have access to the same human and financial resources to accomplish it. You're making an assumption that the human resources are able to be responsive to their needs. And you're making an assumption that if they can't be, that in some cases you have families that can afford a tutor. But what happens to the families and the students that don't or can't? And so that's why for me, I'm staunchly against homework. And quite frankly, I'm against any type of learning that occurs outside of the school grounds that isn't universally accessible. And so on a side note, I do want to share with you all, being mindful of the current challenges we're faced with. One of the things that I've encouraged educators to do is, if you know you're going to shift to or maintain a remote learning environment going into the start of the school year, there's 2 things that I would normalize right from the beginning. One is that social and emotional check-in. So you all saw it in 2 capacities. You saw it with the Google form, and then you also saw it, even though we couldn't do it, you know, I would still encourage you all to play around with Pear Deck. I would do that. That would be normalized for me right from the beginning. And anytime I have interaction with students, that's the first thing that I would do. And then the second thing I would encourage you all to consider doing is utilizing technology, and however you can accumulate the information is I would have the students do a resource inventory. And what I mean by that is I would have the students assess, what do you have access to in your home that you can determine will help us in our learning together? If we're going to be remote, or we're going to be at minimum 50% digital, I want to know what everyone has access to at the home that you can determine will help you accomplish the learning that we're going to do. And then I would, whatever you see that's across the board, that now becomes your base. That's whatever is normalized as far as accessibility for the students, that is universal, that is your base. So if all of my students were to say, I have access to paper, perfect. So that's one. Now what else? Anything, and then anything that every single student has, now you have a starting point. And that's what I would do under the current situation. And quite frankly, I would love to see that be normalized going forward. And that's precisely why I share the whole idea around Techquity, that no matter how pretty packaged the pedagogy is, if we don't have the right culture, if it's not inclusive, if it's not accessible, if it's not equitable, no pedagogy matters. And in fact, I'm going to make an even stronger statement to share with you all. When I was in high school, my AP US history teacher, my AP American Lit teacher, and my AP biology teachers utilized, and this is back in the 80s, so it's nothing new, they utilized an inquiry-based and Socratic-based method. However, I can share with you all, being the only Black male student in those classes and undergoing consistent degrees of microaggressions and trauma, it didn't matter how great their pedagogy was. I had to endure the learning environment as a byproduct of playing the school game, because I knew having an AP class on my transcripts is going to look better when it comes to applying to college or university. Fortunately for me, I had athletic gifts that allowed me to be able to do that in college, but I couldn't rely on those because I knew then, especially because of my father, all it takes is one injury and that's gone. So no matter how pretty package of pedagogy is, if we don't have the right culture, then it's not going to matter. And remember, I break it down to those three base areas. Am I seen? Am I heard? Am I loved? And so that leads me to a game I want to play with you all. So we're going to play a quick game. I'm going to ask you to stand up. And as you all can probably see, yes, I am a fan of Game of Thrones. I was not happy with season 8, but I will share with you this game. So all of you hopefully have your cell phone. And I'm going to ask you to do the following. Since we can't do it in groups, we'll just do it together here. We don't need to introduce name, title, and location unless you all don't know each other. In fact, if you all don't know each other, I would say whoever takes the microphone, just share those things. And several of you, you can even type it in. I'd love for you to share the last picture taken on your phone and some story context around that. And please make sure that picture is appropriate. And since we're not forming groups, we'll just do it with a few of you. And you all are, I love the comments in the chat as well. And I'd love to carve out some time towards the end of the session to respond to some of your questions. So you can either type it in the chat. I would say keep it short so that the chat doesn't scroll too fast. And if any of you want to turn on your microphone, you can just share what is the picture, the last picture taken on your phone and the story context around it, please.
The last picture on my phone is a picture of my twin grandsons, and I was babysitting all 4 of my grandkids for the first time on a couple days ago. The boys are just a year old, so they're awful cute.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol.
The last
Andrea, how about you go, and then Anne, you can go right after Andrea, please.
Okay, the last picture that I took on my phone was homemade ice cream that I made.
Oh, nice.
With some strawberries. My partner was working nights last night, so I teased him by sending him the picture.
Okay, that's not fair because I wasn't able to travel out to Nova Scotia because I would have said, I want some of that ice cream too.
And it's no sugar added.
Yeah, well, you use fresh strawberries, so that's good enough, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Save some for me. And go for it, please.
I have a picture of the books I have in a particular mystery series because I organized them in order so I could figure out which ones I still needed to ask for on hold from the library.
Nice. Thank you. Very cool. And for those of you put in the chat, thank you so much for sharing the last photo taken on your phone and the story context around it. Okay, I have a big reveal for you all of this activity later. So what I want to do is share with you this quote from a personal friend and one of my favorite educators on the planet, Dr. Christopher Emdin. If you're not familiar with his name, he wrote a book called For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too. And he also started Hip Hop Ed, which is, you know, if you want to think in terms of being culturally relevant, it's basically teaching math and English language arts and really language in general through hip hop. But this quote is apropos for what this session is about, which is emotional intelligence cannot be operationalized without cultural astuteness. And the whole idea around cultural astuteness is, are we aware of, mindful of, and have a deeper understanding of the culture of our students, of their unique identities, their unique cultures, and then ultimately in a natural byproduct of that can be operationalized is our emotional intelligence. So take in terms of what I shared with you all around that form that you filled out, that was my ability to be more emotionally intelligent, i.e. culturally responsive to my students, because they were able to share more with me. And I'll share with you more around that in just a moment. And that's where you get into the whole idea around culture. So I'm watching the time because we're going to run out of time. So I want to share with you all a couple of quick things as we kind of shift through some of this. So when you think in terms of culture, I divide into 3 distinct categories. So there's the top tier, which is highly visible and low mental intensity. Those are things like the clothes we wear, the music we listen to, how we dance, books we consume, things of that nature. Those are the top tier culture things, highly visible, low mental intensity. The next layer down are still visible, but a higher degree of mental intensity. And those are things like our greeting patterns. You know, how do we greet each other? Is it a handshake? Is it a kiss on each cheek? Is it a hug? The vernacular that we use, you know, our vocal intonations, the way we communicate, and also things like our concepts of courtship. Yeah, those areas. And so, and I focus on our speech patterns and vernacular because that's one of the areas that I have always found to be problematic in schools, is that there is a hierarchy placed on language and the ways in which we verbally communicate. And so I'll give you all an example. Can you put in the chat if you've ever heard the phrase code switch? Okay, so we only got a couple of yeses. So actually a few yeses now. So for those of you that have never heard code switch, I will put it to you in a cultural context. And Gail, you live it daily, moment by moment. Thank you, Gail. So for those of you that put no, code switching is essentially the following. Your speech pattern and even the vernacular that you use is not likely to be the same same across all contexts or environments that you're in. So for example, when I'm hanging out with many of my close friends in Los Angeles, my vernacular and speech pattern is not going to be the same as me talking with you all right now. And the whole idea around that is that we don't want to place a hierarchical value on the use of language. And so what I used to always tell my students, for example, is you want to understand the context that you're in, context and environment that you're in, and be able to effectively identify what is the most effective way for me to communicate within this context and this environment. That way, you understand that when you're hanging out with your friends, whatever you're doing, that's one way of communicating. When you're in an academic environment, that's a different way of communicating. And in the problematic part of that is when teachers do what's called tone policing, where they try to tell students that the way that they speak or the way that they communicate is inappropriate, because what they're doing is they're placing a cultural hierarchical value on the way students communicate, rather than saying, you need to understand the environment and the context and be able to code switch to adapt to that particular environment. What you find is code switching is really prevalent along Black, Indigenous, people of color, and dependent upon and on geography. And in fact, for time's sake, I'll just condense this part down. I used to ask the question, is code switching cultural or geographical? And I will share with you all it's both. Because I have many friends that live in the southern part of the United States that when they dial, an 800 number or a customer service number, they do the best they can to eliminate their southern accent, because their southern accent is usually associated with a lower degree of intelligence. And then conversely to that, I've even challenged people around the idea that, using what's called the Queen's English or a heavy British accent is usually associated with a higher degree of intelligence. And if you really break it down, it's really absurd to apply an intelligence level to an accent and the use of language. To me, it's what are you communicating? How are you communicating it? And understanding what is the most effective in the environment that you're in. And Vicki is absolutely right. Behavior is communication as well. We don't have the time, unfortunately. I wish we had 3 hours, because I could really break it down to you all about, cultural astuteness and the ways in which we communicate via our own cultures. But ultimately, the third level that I want to share with you all is a really deeply rooted stuff that isn't as obvious as far as visibility, but it's very high mental intensity. And it's things like our concepts of pain, our concepts of gender identity, our concepts of elderness or age, and also a byproduct of many of our biases. Now, again, for time's sake, We have 12 cognitive biases, and bias is not necessarily always a bad thing. In fact, in some cases, bias is a good thing. The acknowledgement and the awareness is we all have it, and by our biases dictate our actions, interactions with others. When it comes to culture, the question you have to ask yourself is, are my biases allowing me to apply a social hierarchy that is actualized in my actions and interactions with others? So for example, am I applying a hierarchy, again, to the speech patterns? Because ultimately, if you hear a speech pattern that is not normalized for you, your bias is going to be aligned with, it's not the bandwagon effect. Oh, it's the group effect, which means that my bias is saying a larger group that I've been exposed to communicates in this way. So therefore that is normalized for me. So therefore that is the only appropriate way to do it. And now my actions and interactions are going to take that bias and apply it and create a cultural social hierarchy aligned with culture, rather than being mindful of the way that I communicate and what is normalized for me may not be the same as that for a student or a colleague or something like that. Once I'm aware of it, it's help me understand. Remember going back to what I shared in the keynote, empathetic and attentive? I hear what you're saying. Help me understand what you're communicating to me. You see, that changes that hierarchy to where it's a more balanced dynamic. And this is where you get into the awareness, the acknowledgement, awareness. And when you do that, that's when it becomes normalized. That's where it becomes sustainable. And so this is one of the conditions I'll share with you all that is aligned with being a culturally responsive educator. And like I said, because you all have done work with Dr. Holly, hopefully some of these will resonate with you all. That, you know, and again, remember I mentioned earlier in this session, hyper-localized and contextual learning experiences. Social situations are among those. And especially if you think in terms of how much deficit language is used in education, to where, you know, I'll give you all another example, and I'm being mindful of the time. And Sandy, I know you're on this call. I knew we were pushing it with an hour with this, so I'm going to do my best to capture as much as I can in summation in the next 10 minutes. And I appreciate all of your contributions here. But this is an example of this one right here is an example of when I look at the data. So let me share with you all an example of how big data and data in general is dehumanizing. Can you all put in the chat if you are married and your parents are married, or if your parents are deceased, if your parents were still married up to the time in which they are deceased? And just a simple yes is fine here. Okay, so some of you put yes, some of you put no, some of you put yes and no. Perfect. Okay, so, and thank you all very much for sharing that. I know it is definitely a more personalized question, so I appreciate you sharing that. So for those of you that put yes, I'll give you an example. Basically, the data, and the data, believe it or not, is consistent in Canada as well to a large extent in my research. 50% of all marriages end in divorce. So for those of you that put yes and yes, I'm going to humanize the data, that big data, and say to you, are you willing to divorce your spouse right now to save your parents' marriage? And obviously, we all know the answer is absolutely not no. And that's why I mentioned the whole idea around the bigger the number, the more it disconnects from the human experience or human condition. And that's why we need to be mindful of data. In the context of this slide you're looking at, when I see things like, well, there's a learning gap with X demographic of students, or students are performing below a grade level, my question is always a follow-up to, okay, what societal or environmental factors are likely to lead to that conclusion that are outside the scope of any degree of individual deficit? And this is why I really am staunchly against the use of growth mindset and grit in education. Because you see, I had students that, as I shared with you all, that were undergoing a lot of trauma in their home. Them making it to school on a consistent and daily basis was them showing grit already. So how dare a school apply a cultural disconnected lens to those students that is absent of or is exclusionary of a societal context? Yeah, Lynn, I'm with you on that. Because the thing is we, in education, there's always, in fact, I'm going to Like, I'm going to be authentic. I'm going to tell you all. Grit and growth mindset, or white-centered terminology, that it was, in my research, was used as a way to excuse the students, predominantly cisgender white males, on their marginal performances in school. And that's where they come from. And that's precisely why I push back, and I will argue with anyone around the use of those terms, especially if you use those terms and exclude any degree of societal context. You think about how often you look at students that come from economically challenged areas. It's no coincidence that those schools in general tend to be lower performing than their counterparts in more wealthy and more affluent areas. All right, continuing on for time's sake. I'm going to skip past, actually, I'm going to share this quote, and then I'm going to skip to another condition and another quote. And this is one where, if you go back to, remember I had mentioned the 3 components of a strong social and emotional learning program. This is a very strong quote, and I'm a huge Zora Hurston fan. So by the way, if you haven't read any of her works, I strongly recommend you all consider it. But this is another one around, remember I mentioned no SEL program, sustainable without student agency. Here's one. If you're silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. And this is where I talk about equity, access, and opportunity. Are we providing access and opportunity for student agency, for students to share with us how they're feeling and what they're thinking? That makes us more, that lends itself for us to be more responsive. And if we're more responsive, we can be more authentic, we can be more empathetic, and we can create cultures of inclusion. All right. So with that being said, what I want to do is I want to skip to this one, which is another culturally responsive condition. So the organization, your classroom, your school, your district, your system, your board, whatever terminology you use, provides consistent learning support to examine habits of mind, problems of practice, cultural norms that perpetuate inequities. So think in terms of my references around cultural hierarchy and things of that nature. Those by design create inequities. And then you all saw those pictures. So even desks and rows, if that is a habit of mind and the cultural norm, that is inequitable by design. And I recognize that we have to be flexible with things, especially given COVID-19, but that's an example of it. And so now what I want to do is I want to share with you all this graphic here, which is around readings, and especially because you all have done work with Dr. Holly around the fact that, we encourage students to read. We want them to read. I think reading is one of the most empowering things that we can teach students to do, encourage them to do, and give them the opportunity to do. And for time's sake, I can't delve as deeply into this as I would like, but I will share with you all this graphic, which was, now granted, this is more US centric, but I have done my homework around the texts that you all generally assign, and I do speak in generalities, so I recognize that there is going to be exceptions that you all assign as a part of the provincial curriculums there in Canada. And it's just something, use this graphic not to say, okay, Ken, that's more US, not Canadian. Use this graphic as a way for us to be mindful of the fact that the diversity of the books that we offer, or we encourage, or we require students to read, should be representational of the diversity and the beauty of the different cultures that exist there in your province, and really even in your country in general. What you're looking at is more US-centric representations, but in the end, it still is a byproduct of, are we providing students with an opportunity that serves as a mirror, a window, and or a sliding glass door for their learning experience? The mirror should be that I should learn more about myself through an authentic voice in the text that I'm reading, and the significant historical figures or contributions to, in your case, Canadian society or global society, from an authentic voice that might be representational of me. And then the window is, am I learning about someone who fits the category of other, a different culture, through an authentic voice that gives me a window into them? And then a sliding glass door is, am I allowed to step into their world to some degree? So I'm going to share with you all a couple of quick things in closing, and then I'm just going to go straight to culturally relevant themes that are aligned with the activity we did. Here in the U.S., there's a constant, and if you all follow me on Twitter, you've seen it and I've responded to it. This whole idea around student health, and they say, well, you got a Maslow before Bloom. You got a Maslow before Bloom. and I'm going to share with you all, and I'm very proud to share this as well, that not only is that extremely problematic for me, what I share with folks is that they need to understand that Abraham Maslow spent a lot of time with First Nations folks in Alberta and what is present-day North Dakota and areas of Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's the Blackfoot peoples. He learned how their way of life, or their look at their community and society, was based on a series of concentric circles. He then appropriated that, whitewashed it and westernized it, and created the hierarchy of needs without citing the source and without referencing where he learned it from. And there is, it's Cindy Blackstock is one of the professors. She was at the University of Alberta, and I believe she's at, she's not at Simon Fraser. I think she's at BC, University of British Columbia. She has published research, and there's others that have published the research around it as well, that includes pictures and citations around the fact of what Abraham Maslow did. And I share that with you all because that goes into the whole idea of this around mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. How much harm would it have? You think about how much harm it does in fact of you're silencing the First Nations folks, you're misrepresenting your learning, and quite frankly, you're appropriating the culture without saying, here's the source, here's what I learned, and here's how I've adapted it to my learning. And so I do want to share that the sliding glass door element was developed by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. The original idea of mirrors and windows was by Emily Stile from the Seeds Project. And then there's another First Nations or Indigenous professor, Dr. Debbie Reese, who added that sometimes those windows have curtains because you have to make an effort to pull the curtains back to be able to get a window into that culture. Not every culture is open and there for you to just learn from or take from. You have to make an effort to learn about the culture in order to be immersed into the experiences of the culture. And so what I just want to do now, for time's sake, is I just want to go to the whole idea around Techquity, which we've already done a little bit of it. I'll share with you all one other activity. I'm going to go 1 minute over time. So I'll share with you another activity I used to do with students using Padlet, which this is what I do in my workshop. Students all have their cell phones, or most students have cell phones. Most students like taking selfies. So one of the things that I would do, and that you all might consider doing this for your remote learning, especially if you go remote, is I'd have students take a selfie. I'd have them post a selfie on a Padlet, and I would say, when you post it, I need two pieces of information from you. One, I want to know something that you're passionate about, and two, I want to know a skill that you have that if you didn't ask, it wouldn't know. And by the way, no skill is off limits. And by doing that, that gave me a window into the type of photos that the students would take of themselves and how they're representing themselves, what passions they have, and what skills they have. It also served as a window for their classmates because everyone had access to the Padlet. And here's the benefit of us doing that. What ended up happening is whenever students would work on projects and they would form groups, I learned from one of my students, who I then started normalizing it by telling other students, again, the acknowledgement and awareness, is that he would go and look at the Padlet and he would try to work with classmates that had skills that he didn't have, because he recognized that if I work with classmates that have skills that I don't have, our overall group project is going to be that much better. And so you see, even just by doing an activity that is normalized for students, you got a phone, you love yourself some self, so take a selfie, but here's how I want you to do it. And then we use that information. So again, it provided a window into the lives of students, and it's provided the students a window into their classmates. The sliding glass door was them going and working together with their classmates. And so ultimately, real quick, that is how I share. Vicky, yeah, I'll do my best to pull up Sandy, I'll email you the link, because I posted it on Twitter back in April because it was just being posted so much it was annoying. That is how I define Techquity, which is merging the use of educational technologies with culturally responsive and relevant learning experiences to support student development of essential skills.